Hello, everyone, and thanks so much, Jess, for nice introduction. Welcome to a session that promises a lot. We only have 55 minutes to talk about how do we quality assure the AI outcome and make sure it's right, and what right means. I have with me three phenomenal panelists that need no introduction. I have Professor Virginia Dignum, Professor Luciano Floridi, and Dr. Reuben Spins. Before I'll pass the mic and the screen to all three of them to give us a bit of a provocation or reflection on the topic of Audit of AI, I wanted to briefly give you a little bit of a context on where we are in terms of AI and deployment and scaling, and why do we discuss about AI audit in the first place. So, as it feels like AI enters into a more stable phase with more and more proof of concept going into scaling, into production, we are also seeing much more focus and attention to do this work in a responsible manner, to make sure that issues of an end-to-end governance of the AI initiatives, also the risk management and apply ethics, are thoroughly considered across the life cycle of the development process. And with that in mind, I was like, we're thinking, but when do we start measuring that what we're doing is right? And how do we set up some ways of measuring and measures themselves to be able to go back and track and compare? During the last few fantastic days at CogX, in the panels I attended, different speakers have actually started calling for the need to have an audit of AI. It was Wendy that mentioned we can learn quite a lot from the financial services industry and how they proceed of having this balanced approach in between regulation, audit, and self-regulation, and how they manage to achieve trust in their services. Also, Roger Taylor from Center for Data Ethics and Innovation has been talking about how AI audit can boost the trust and confidence we have in those technology to deliver societal outcome. And lastly, Sir Ronald Cohen talked about the need for audit of AI from an impact perspective, right? How do we start measuring both positive and negatives impacts of AI and being able to address accordingly? With that in mind, I think I will invite my panelists to give us a few minutes introspection or reflection on the topic, and then we'll go straight into the questions from you guys and some questions we have prepared. Virginia, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you all for listening. It's my pleasure to be here today and to discuss this very important issue with the panel and with all of you listening to us today. Yes, auditing of AI is an important condition for trust. We have to have the means and ways to be able to really trust these systems. And the trusting is not only ensuring the ethical and legal alignment of systems, it's also in a very basic way ensuring that the system technically works the way that it's supposed to work, that it says what the box says it does. But even though I'm a computer scientist and I have been developing AI systems for the best of the last 30 years, AI nowadays, the way we are dealing with AI, the way we are using AI, the way AI is impacting the world is not just a technology. It's really a combination of social and technical factors. And when we talk about the auditing of AI, we have to start first by thinking about what do we mean by auditing AI and what are we auditing. And I do believe that we have to take a position in which we have to combine the auditing of the technical, of the systems, of the software, and of the computational basis for the AI systems, take that in a very formal and very precise and mathematical way. But at the same time, we have to have the tools and the means to audit the old processes which are put in place to develop, to deploy, to implement, to use, to regulate, to manage the AI systems that are being developed. So auditing needs to be a combination, in my opinion, between the technical verification of systems with a more process-based approach to the auditing and monitoring of the processes that are leading to the systems that are being used.
Thank you, Virginia. That's really interesting, the fact that you have stressed that AI is not just data and algorithms, but the context it operates in. And when we start measuring, we need to make sure that we also focus on the processes and all the capabilities that come about to create that context. It's more or less the same the same line that Wendy gave us yesterday as a food of thought is move away from audited solely data and algorithms into the context itself, which makes it so much more complex. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is in relation to the EU regulation that's expected to come somewhere at the end of this year, beginning of next year. And how do you think their focus on creating a risk taxonomy for AI will in any way impact the appetite for AI audit and to speed up the existing initiatives or the existing outlets around Europe mainly in starting thinking seriously about audit of AI?
Thank you for the question. Yes, according to the white letter that the European Commission has developed, and I must stress that that is not part of the work that me and my colleagues, including Luciano, have done in the high-level expert group. We developed the guidelines for trustworthy AI, but this white letter from the European Commission is a work of the European Commission, not directly developed by the group. Just to make clear, and often I have to explain that I have no influence whatsoever, more than anyone else, on the contents of this letter. I'm in a sense a bit worried with this risk-based approach to AI. I see the point, and I see that it's important to have consideration of the impact, the impact and the risk that AI potentially might bring, but it's also potentially opening a door to define what is a risk and who is going to determine what are the riskful impacts, the riskful applications, the riskful techniques that are going to be used. Because if you read the letter, it says something, a combination of the application of risk technology with a risk application or context. That's the kind of things they want to focus on. But if we don't really have a very clear definition of what these applications are and these technologies and these techniques are, the door is open to each one of us, developers or deployers or users, to determine, yes, what I'm doing is not risk, is not in this application. I'm not using this type of issues, or even at the extreme saying, no, I'm just developing software. I'm not developing AI, and therefore is not riskful. So it will be very difficult, I think, to really scope, and that will be leading potentially to a complex definition of how we are going to take the risk into account.
That's really interesting, to the aspect of we need to clarify what we're talking about when we mean AI, risk, and an audit of AI, but also being able to agree on taxonomies that are used in various contexts, because obviously whenever that clarity doesn't exist, we are in a moving ground and we don't all understand what we're talking about. Thanks so much, Virginia.
That starts with the understanding what AI is. And if we listen to the current understanding of AI, it ranges all the way from a magic thing which comes out of nowhere and we just can hope that it will treat us nicely, to just business as usual and anything in between. So it becomes very difficult with this type of narrative, and we really need to start making a much more precise and auditable or verifiable narrative of what we are talking about when we talk about AI.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Luciano, how do we see the audit of the AI with ethical lenses? Obviously, ethics is such a thorny issue to audit or to start measuring. So where do we start? How do we start in the first place?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's good to follow on after Virginia, because a lot of the concepts that she has already explained are in place. I think there's a misunderstanding that needs to be clarified where ethics is something like what my grandmother would be recommending. Be a good boy, don't steal, don't kill, check when you're crossing the road left and right. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is designing technologies that are going to make a difference for a better society. And that means not only being legal, but doing a little bit more than what is legal. Legal means compliance with the law, and that is the minimum required, is what is necessary. Being ethical means doing a little bit more than what is strictly necessary. An analogy with football may help. The legal system gives you the rules to the game. Winning the game is a different story. It means playing according to the rules, doing it a little bit better than the other person in question. And here is my comment on an ethical perspective about auditing of AI. Normally, and I hope to close pretty quickly, we look at ethical analysis as able to achieve or deal with 5 different goals. First of all, you signal to other people that you are that kind of company, a company that is interested in making sure they plays better than other companies. Then, number 2, your auditing of, say, a particular piece of software, say, of machine learning used in that company, builds awareness within the company. The practices, the design, the deployment, you get a little bit better understanding internally of what's going on. Then there's collaboration, company to company or business to business, as we say. I do my auditing, you do your auditing. We might be able to collaborate more successfully if we are on the same page. Number 4, and almost there, sometimes it's helpful to solve some problems. I mean, maybe the machine learning in that particular bank or in the insurance company, in their manufacturing context, is not doing as well as it could. A bit of ethical assessment of how better that could work, that makes a difference. And finally, competition. Imagine companies could go around and say, I am compliant not only with the law, but also with its ethical standards set up by the group with, where we are with Virginia or the OECD rules. That is a competitive advantage compared to people who don't have that auditing extra. All these 5 factors make a difference, and I think that is why we're talking about ethics as well, not just compliance today in terms of auditing of AI.
Those are really interesting points, which makes me think, Luciano, that we need to start raising awareness the fact that ethics is not all about compliance. One of the challenges we have in the operationalizing it of ethical principle is that what is ethics in relation to the business operation. And I think if we start clarifying what it is, will be easier then for us to go back and measure if what that is correct, done correctly, or as a certain level of quality. Can you help us somehow define what ethics means for a business? Why ethics is important for a business and an organization in general, that it aims to deliver a value, has a mission to achieve?
Sure. Let me give you an analogy and an example so we can deal with both sides of the issue. The analogies with sustainability and green policies in industry. I mean, today there is an acquired point, and people will, for example, shop for that particular product, which not only is perfectly legal, but it does something more. Maybe that chicken has been treated more humanely, in a greener way. I remember now with Virginia talking a lot about the eggs being sustainable and so on. So that is something that we have acquired. We have acquired through discussion. It's not something you can one day say, oh, these are the 10 sort of ethical principles we need to apply. It's an alternative process with the whole society. What we think is right, what we think is good, over and above the simple ethical chicken off the counter. This is the analogy. The actual example is today we sit in terms of auditing, quote unquote, with a coronavirus app everywhere. One thing that people have realized is that you need to produce that software open for inspection. It's not a legal requirement. It is not written anywhere that you have to do that. But every society, here or there, centralized, decentralized, whatever the model, everybody thinks, no, that's a good practice. That's the ethical thing to do. There you go. We have an agreement. We have a sense of what is right, over and above what is legally required. So the analogy and the example show us that it's actually doable. We just have to do a lot of thinking. But that's why philosophers are useful.
Philosophers are always useful, right? So I remember one of the founders of Skype was advocating for more students to take the philosophy classes instead of MBA because it helps you with the critical thinking. So here you go, guys who are listening to us. You might want to consider taking some philosophy classes to understand ethics much better and being able to be a better ethicist. Thank you so much, Luciano. And now, next, we're going to Dr. Reuben Beams, soon to be associate professor, if I got that right. And the brain behind one of the most important, if not the most important documents we have right now, it's coming from ICO, the Audit of AI. Rubens, how do we see the Audit of AI from the perspective of ICO and the regulators camp in general?
Thank you. Thanks for the question, and thanks for inviting me to the panel. So yeah, I'll just give a quick perspective on how we at the Information Commissioner's Office have addressed some of the challenges relating to data protection and AI. So when I joined the ICO in late 2018, there were a lot of questions about how data protection law may apply to AI. So these questions ranged from things like if a data subject, so someone whose data we're processing, wants their data to be erased from the training data that we use to build an AI system, how do we deal with that kind of request? Do we need to delete the model that the data was trained from? Questions like if we have to ensure that our system is non-discriminatory, how do we do that in a data protection compliant way? Or if we're using an AI service that was built by another organization, and if they then use the data that they process from us to improve their model, does that make them a data controller, which would mean that they had extra responsibilities? So these are all kind of legal compliance questions, but I think they all have quite important ethical implications as well. So what we're aiming to do is to address these questions for several reasons. First of all, because we as a regulator needed to have positions on them, because we'll be reviewing data protection impact assessments from organizations, we'll be doing audits, doing investigations, and we need to know what our position is on these questions. We also wanted to help organizations to understand how they can best comply. And so in these cases, there's often things that aren't necessarily required by the law, but that are really good practices that will in many cases help organizations to be both data protection compliant, but also ethical. So we wanted to come up with guidance which would allow organizations to understand how we're interpreting the application of the law, but also to understand some of the best practices that they can implement internally in order to minimize problems that they might have coming down the line if they don't pursue those kinds of best practices. So our framework aims to cover both of those areas. And whether you are an organization which is building your own AI system or procuring one from elsewhere. It's also aimed at different audiences. So on the one hand, it does focus a lot on compliance. So it will be useful to practitioners who work as data protection officers, general counsel, risk managers. But it's also aimed at technology specialists who understand how these systems work in practice. So machine learning engineers, data scientists, software developers, cybersecurity people. So we're trying to hit both of those audiences, which is often a challenge. But I think a lot of the legal questions and the ethical questions will depend on conversations between those two different audiences. I'll just finally mention that to some extent, the things we talk about in this guidance will allow organizations to pursue things that they want to do as an ethical obligation as well as a legal obligation. So, for instance, those who want to ensure that their systems are not discriminating. So, in addition to any obligations they may already have under equalities law, we outline the ways that they can do that in a data protection compliant way. So, for instance, we identify the lawful bases and the conditions that they would need to that they can rely on in the Data Protection Act in order to process things like special category data, which is often necessary if you want to audit your AI system for discrimination. So I think I'll end it there, but hopefully that gives you a flavor of what we've been working on.
That's a phenomenally important work, and I'll encourage all of you to go and download the paper, which is it's before the consultation. I think that you guys are expected to release their final guidance very soon, so keep an eye on that. I think what I took out of what your introspection is something really important that we don't talk about enough about, which is the public education. How do we, knowing the fact that building regulation and laws takes quite a lot of time, how do we gain the momentum and being able to educate the public so that we can distill the right behavior when we develop AI. So it's not just about the frameworks and the guidelines and the restrictive rules that are to be applied or not. It's also about human behavior, good human behavior. And ultimately, this is what ethics is all about. It's about being able to have the right behavior that will allow us to build products that are beneficial. But I will want to jump a little bit further in the future when we are in a better place with testing those frameworks that we develop at the moment, and ask you, Reuben, a more, I would say, not even philosophical question, but a question that is more about the nature of AI. The fact that there seems to be a little bit of a tension in between the nature of AI as a stochastic technology and the fact that most of our processes around regulation, governance, risk management are built for deterministic systems. How do we work with that? Because sooner or later, AI is going to push us and disrupt the way we do everything, including managing risk, including auditing.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question. I think it's important to distinguish that you'll have that the way in which AI systems, particularly I'm thinking here of machine learning systems, learn from data can very often be hard to predict, and but that's not the same as it being a non-deterministic system. The thing that you get out at the end is a statistical model, which, at least for the iteration of that model that was trained on a particular data set, will always produce the same output given a set of inputs. So these are systems which are deterministic, even if there is uncertainty in at the beginning in how they will learn from data. So it's important to sort of stress that they have this deterministic quality, because I think that actually helps us a lot in auditing them. So if you know that a system is going to always respond in the same way given a set of inputs, given a set of training data that's been trained on, and given a set of inputs, it's always going to produce the same output. This actually allows us to subject these systems to much more scrutiny than we would a human decision maker. So that's a real opportunity to audit these systems. It's also worth recognizing that in your question that none of these systems are 100% accurate. They're always going to involve trade-offs between different kinds of errors. So false positive errors, false negative errors, and when you design one of these systems, you're always going to be making trade-offs between those errors. So you're committing to the fact that yes, you're releasing something which isn't 100% accurate. So that inherently requires you to focus on the trade-offs you're making between different kinds of errors, because they may have very different impacts on different people in different ways.
That's really, of course.
It's also important to realize that these systems are based on data, that data is always by definition about the past. And what these systems do is extrapolate correlations that it makes on data from the past into our potential future. Once the future is very different from the past, and that's something which we all at this moment are experiencing live, it's extremely difficult to take any attitude about what these results are. If the future is similar to the past, yes, we can, with a high degree of certitude, assume that what the system has seen as correlations in the past can be used in the future. But once the future is very different, then we really have to have extremely caution on using the system. So this is not a fault of the system, it's how the system works, but it's where the human factors and the social and the institutional issues have to come into place. And that's where I say that AI is not just a technology, but all this social technical context around it. And it's up to us to determine and to give the accountability and also take care of the liability in the moment that we are applying systems into an uncertain future, which we cannot really guarantee that the data that we have from the past is doing anything about this future. And that is not something which technology can solve. It's something which society needs to solve.
I think that's an excellent remark to help us go to a wider debate among ourselves around the constraints that go beyond the technical constraints into the conceptual and social and organizational constraints. Because everything you just mentioned, Virginia, is linked with the fact that we as people need to change the way we work with this technology. And as a result, we need to start changing the processes that we put together in certain contexts. And that takes time. While we see, on the other hand, the speed of development and adoption of AI puts a lot of pressure on us, the people, to start thinking differently when it comes to AI. How would you, all of you, comment further, continuing what Virginia started, those constraints, or what do you think will stop auditing of AI, or are some thorny issue that we need to be discussing before we jumping into measuring something or not? Luciano, can I go to you first, please?
Thank you. I think that apart from agreeing with what has been said so far, there's an important point that can perhaps a little bit stress, which is being engineered artifacts. Of course, we can also think ahead in terms of what we want them to be able to open to. So imagine we start thinking in terms of, say, machine learning or natural language processing algorithms, in terms of I want to make sure that at the end of the design, development, deployment, I'm also able to do auditing. Well, all the way back to the design stage, I might want to modify the design of that particular product to make sure that auditing or transparency or explainability are becoming a little bit easier down the road, as opposed to, oh, look, we have a system, now we have to do stuff with it, which we're not prepared for. So I think that what we're going to see in the future should we call them a sort of auditing-friendly kind of design that opens up the development of tools to procedures that then will feed back into the quality assessment of what we have in our hands. Now, just a quick comment, if I may, about the trade-offs and the data. I completely agree.
Yes.
Trade-offs are often about false negative, false positive, the accuracy and the reliability. I'd like to also add, as a footnote, that trade-offs are also between preferences. And we know, for example, that in terms of fairness, mathematically provable forms of fairness in terms of statistical analysis are incompatible with others. So at some point, you need to decide what kind of sort of trade-off between different preferences you need to opt. And it's not a matter of, in this case, would be not a matter of false or positive, false negative, but a matter of choices. And that, again, is a strategy. And the data as well. I mean, it's important to remember they often come and look at the past, but we can also generate data about the future. I mean, foresight analysis, synthetic data, that is also where what Virginia mentioned as a risk becomes interesting and important to take into account. Otherwise, we take these things as if it were there's a kind of a magic boxes on which we depend, and that's not the case.
That's some excellent point here, and thank you for bringing the trade-off and tension that we discuss so much in ethics. It makes me think that when we talk about applying ethics in our organization, we need to learn how to do it. We need to unlearn what we have learned and learn how to be reflective and how to really embark in that truly ethical decision making that requires us to pause and reflect and analyze rather than just rush in and achieve a roadmap or deliver a roadmap. One other question I prepare, I think I'm going to ask this question and one other before I'm going to start taking a question from you guys in the audience, is in relation to the tension in between national jurisdiction and global nature of AI and the organization, and how do we manage that tension that sooner or later will manifest itself in one way or another. Virginia, Luciano, do you want to start? Thinking that from your position of a high-level expert groups on AI, will be able to provide us with that view.
Ladies first.
So let me have it's in a sense is a tension which is not specific for AI. We have been dealing with the multinational and global issues in other technologies and in other parts of society. So it's not something which is only specific for AI. What we do see with AI is that there is a certain ease to copy and just transport things which have been used or deployed in a certain context into other contexts without really taking into account the difference between the cultures or national legislation or national preferences, let's say. And that is something which we really need to take into account. I don't think that is something to be, it can be regulated, but it also should be in a flexible way. And we see that in the terms of how this type of guidelines and principles that have been developed by many different organizations and societies across the world or at national and international level. Usually they are of a level of abstraction which is easy to translate from one to another context. What makes it difficult is that because they are such an abstract level, it's in one end very difficult to disagree. I mean, we would disagree that we want systems to be fair or to be inclusive, but how we are really going to translate this type of very abstract principles into concrete functionalities in a computer system or in an algorithm or in the data that we use, those are the issues which probably need to be taken into account at national level. And we also need to understand that different jurisdictions might have different interpretations for the same type of concept or abstract concept.
Excellent point. Excellent points. Luciano, anything?
I completely agree, and I think that is only a comment to add to what Virginia has already said very convincingly, which is some of the things that we have in technology are not reached by legislation top down, as if someone were like kind of a god of technology and decided that from now on that's the way it is, but have emerged by sort of trade agreements and pulling force of, for example, a particular business or sometimes a government, or in our case, maybe the European Union. Look at what has happened with the GDPR. The GDPR has been a European legislation for European data, but it has been increasingly influential in determining, roughly speaking, where people think the direction of traveling lies. And I think we could do exactly the same with AI, broadly speaking, or maybe not to be more specific, robotics, machine learning, natural language processing, and so on, when we start as a European Union making clear what is the socially acceptable. And if we do a good job, hopefully, then other countries, other business models, so on, will follow. I think what we're going to see here is not so much something like a regulation that all of a sudden, boom, decides that that's the way it is, but regulations will emerge as a consensus, and that consensus will generate sort of convincing power behind that regulation, if the regulation is good. So it's an interchange of views which make Europe particularly well placed at this stage, if we don't screw up badly, in terms of setting the direction of traveling for AI as well.
Excellent points here. And I'm thinking that regardless of where we are as a country in this political landscape, I think there's so much benefit we can have from sharing best practices and knowledge, regardless of what the political groups will decide for us. Rubens, I have two questions that will bundle. They are coming your way, and they are both very interesting in their own. First is one around the current structures of governance and risk management. We can anchor the audit of AI, and what can we learn, for example, from data protection, and could be easily transferable to all the other ethical principles. And the second one, really interesting around the best practices status. Is there any appetite from the ICO and for other regulators from your awareness to translate those voluntary best practices into a mandatory one?
Two good questions. I was wondering if I could also just add on to the point about the previous question about global nature of AI. So I think it's important to recognize that, like many systems these days, AI is a part of a very complex supply chain. So the data may be sourced from one country. The data may be labeled by crowd workers in another country. That may be turned into a model, and that model may be sold in a different country. And like, you know, your smartphone, there are many kind of harmful effects that can arise and exploitation that may be involved at various stages in that supply chain. So I think, as well as thinking about, you know, how different national laws can try to up the global kind of ethical standards of AI, we need to think very much about the ethics of the supply chain of AI, because I think that's you know, much like in other areas, exploitation of workers, exploitation of the environment, very much involved in all of that as well. So onto the two questions you just posed. So I think some of the practices from data protection, which might be a good sort of foundational basis for other kinds of AI auditing. So I think data protection impact assessments are really quite a powerful model for other kinds of impact assessments. So these require you to think about the risks to the rights and freedoms of the individuals whose data you're going to use. So in this case, the people who are going to be either involved in, whose data will be involved in the training of an AI system, or who will be affected by the AI system. So I think DPIAs are an important one, and I think that the model of an impact assessment can apply elsewhere. You know, things like equalities impact assessments, environmental impact assessments. The other concept I think is quite powerful from data protection is data protection by design. So this says that it's not enough just to design a system and then worry about how you're going to make it compliant afterwards. You have to bake into the design of the system how you're going to facilitate the rights of data subjects in this case, and the various obligations that you might have as an organization right from the very design stage before the product goes live. So I think those are two concepts that I think could be really useful for anchoring auditing of AI in other areas. The final question was, remind me, or have I already done it?
Around the appetite for ICO to translate the voluntary best practices into mandatory ones.
So I think there's no desire to kind of expand into areas of regulation which already exist elsewhere. There is a desire to understand how different areas of regulation intersect with each other. So where data protection meets anti-discrimination or meets freedom of expression, those are all important overlaps that we need to kind of understand. I think it would be, many people may be surprised at the extent to which things which seem like ethical responsibilities are also already data protection responsibilities. So it may be that in many cases, the ethical frameworks people are talking about are already to an extent covered by data protection.
Excellent points. And one of my favorite things is for us to learn from what we already have, and rather than reinvent the wheel every single time. We have created such complex system, the organization we work for and society as a whole. So we need to be mindful when we introduce something new to use what we already have before adding new elements. There's a lot of very good questions that are coming in. Also aware of the time, we only have 15 minutes left. So for all of you who your question have not been answered today, don't worry, we are here. This is just the start of the journey. Hopefully, all of us in the panel and many others within the AI community and beyond will continue this conversation in other forums as well. One of the two questions, I'll bundle two questions that came around the audiences and the result, who do we audit for, and what will be the role of the public in auditing AI, and how will that have an impact on the public services delivered with AI, and how do we take it from there? Who wants to comment on this?
Happy to go first, if you like.
Please,
I think at this stage, if it is a voluntary auditing, often is done in terms of checking internally whether everything is sufficiently of high quality, robust, resilient. It's also, as I said before, a way of signaling and also a competitive advantage. You say, look, no, that's what we're doing. We are the kind of company that takes care of auditing of AI within our own business processes. If and when will become mandatory from our side, then I would expect also the classic, as you said, nothing new. We will not invent a new wheel. There will be companies that will offer auditing of AI as a service. There will be legal requirement in terms of transparency. And the last point about the public being involved, I think that should be an opportunity, not a requirement, of course. You don't want to burden the public with double checking that everything's okay, but it should be available and possible for anyone from the public to be able to say, look, maybe I need to double check that this particular business has done a good job. So I see this here not as a yes/no answer, but more in terms of progressing answers to the problem of auditing AI as we move along in terms of adopting new strategies and new legislations. I think we're moving in the right direction. And as we heard at the beginning of the conversation, as you said, there is a lot of interest and appetite, especially in Europe, for a clear framework where all this can happen in a sort of timely manner.
An excellent point. Virginia, do you want to add?
Yes, let me just shortly add, especially on this issue of the involvement of the public. I see two issues. One is that as public, as general people in general, we all have to have the responsibility for having a critical voice in what we take and what we accept, what we use, what we don't use. This means that the awareness and education should be much more taken to a much more serious stage than what we are doing now. We really need to educate all of us to be able to take this critical voice and therefore to be able to individually decide and if we want and to participate and to evaluate the products and services and applications that we are using or that are being used for us. But on the other hand, I think we should also take into account that the auditing is a complex and process, is a process which requires professionals that understand how this works and how this should be done. And the involvement of the public should not be seen as kind of taking the right in your own hands and taking our own preference as ways to audit or to evaluate or judge the work that has been provided. So in one hand, yes, the critical voice and the responsibility to decide and evaluate what we do, it's an important thing for the public to do, but we should not we should use the professional auditors to really provide these quality assurances and auditing assurances that are needed at the general level.
This makes me think of something that Wendy Hall said the other day, that audit of AI is going to be a new profession that is going to require new specialists. So for all of you guys watching, keep in mind that might be a new avenue for you to work in AI as an AI auditor. Reuben, anything else you want to add on these questions?
One thing I would say is that there's a danger when it comes to consulting the public on things, that the ways in which public consultations are run are set up in order to get the answer that the organization doing the consultation wants to get. So there's a very real danger of using consultation as a means of washing away responsibility, or co-opting the public into agreeing with what the company wanted to do anyway. So I think in order to have meaningful input and control, external views have to be backed up with meaningful controls they may have. So they, at least enabling those who are being consulted to say, actually, no, I don't think this is ethical at all. I don't think this should go ahead at all. And being actually willing to consider that option. If the option of pulling something is never on the table to begin with, then I think people who participate in those kinds of consultations will lose trust and will ultimately feel like they've been used.
That's excellent points. We don't have too much time for more questions, but I have one that kind of take us back to the beginning, which talks about the nature of audit and how do we define what exactly audit of AI means. And the question is audit in sense that accounts are audited, or is it something different? I suspect that it's a question that some of my colleagues in financial audit will ask, hence the need for us to be very clear on defining not just AI and risk and governance, but also audit of AI. Do you guys want to give a little bit of, certainty that on the subject, and the fact that we expect the term audit itself to be disrupted as well? We're not going to necessarily follow the same path as a financial audit.
Maybe I can have a go. I think indeed it's a very important question, and it's where we start. What do we mean by auditing of AI, and what exactly are we auditing? It's the starting point, and it's a discussion which we have to really take to a next level in the coming time across the different groups and different agencies and so on. It is not just about auditing the products, not just about auditing the data or the algorithms, at least in my opinion, but it's also auditing the processes and the organizations involved in the whole of the let's say, the supply chain of AI development, use, and deployment. So we really have to take a broader view on auditing and start thinking about what are the kind of tools, the type of methods that can be used to audit the different parts, and also to ensure that the integration of those parts is kept consistent and coherent.
Maybe I could add a quick point, which is sometimes you get the question about, but if the auditors are auditing someone, who audits the auditors, so to speak, who controls the controllers, who checks those who check. And it looks like an endless regression. So you have controllers of controllers of controllers. The truth is that in a decent democracy, you go full circle, and it's society that controls the controllers. So ultimately, if we, as we probably going to see, there will be the emergence of a business, another form of service, where auditing of AI is a service offered by companies. The companies themselves will be accountable to a legal system, a society, etc., democracy that puts all this in place. So I would like to avoid the idea that, but you can never control the controllers of the controllers. That's a silly joke. What is true is that you go full back to those who are responsible in the first place. And that's the society in which you develop all this. In terms of, therefore, playing the game, the last point is that you make sure that where this happens, it's good for business. And where this does not happen, it's not so good for business. So you have the incentive to move there where the good auditing cycle improves business and society, as opposed to a short sort of term profit, which will not do any good in terms of long-run companies.
Excellent point. Balancing profit with purpose. It's something that we need to start living by more and more. Reuben, any comments from you?
Just to add, perhaps a slightly pessimistic point, I apologize, but I think we need to be very careful that this new industry, this new sector of AI auditors doesn't end up being captured by their clients. So there's a very long history of auditing not fulfilling its purpose, where big firms are brought in to audit things with an expectation that they will give them the green light, and very few disincentives to actually very few incentives to actually challenge systems where they need to be challenged. So I think if we're going to go down that route, we have to really learn from the mistakes of the past in order to ensure that auditing is meaningful.
This is not at all a negative point. As actually, it's very optimistic. The fact that we had the financial audit ahead of us, they made all the mistakes, and now we make sure we're not going to repeat those ones. So I like that. I have another question for you, Reuben, as well, around the trade-off between accuracy and bias. The question says, in theory, by being less biased, algorithms should be more accurate, but what's your opinion? And link it with audit. Where does this take us in terms of auditing and quality assurance?
So I think whether there's a trade-off between accuracy and bias depends on the situation. I think also the way we talk about bias and accuracy really need a lot of unpacking. But just to give you a flavor of the two circumstances. So in one circumstance, you might have a system where the point of a machine learning algorithm is to produce a model which fits the general population as best as possible. And if you have a minority population where the relationships between the variables you're using to make a prediction and the outcome is different to the general population, but you train you set your algorithm to find the best model to fit the entire population, then it will perform worse on the minority population just as a result of the way you've instructed it. There are cases where you can decrease bias by increasing the amount of data on the minority population, which will raise very real questions about power and privacy. But that's one option. However, there will also be cases where a model will reproduce patterns of discrimination in the real world, and it will do so accurately. It's accurately reproducing those patterns, but we want to break those patterns. So it's not enough to say that we're increasing accuracy to the data, because the data reflects a pattern of structural oppression in the real world that we don't want to reproduce. So I think you have to focus on the particular case in order to deconstruct whether the term bias, the term accuracy, is really what we want to be focusing on. And even then, there will be differences depending on the source of the alleged bias in the system.
Thanks so much, Reuben. As we are running out of time, what I would kindly ask you is to give us a brain teaser, one short snippet that your most important thought that we should all go away and reflect upon it post this session. Virginia, ladies first.
Okay, ladies first. One thing, maybe just on this issue of bias and accuracy. Accuracy sometimes needs more bias. So the issue, I don't think that we should focus so much on bias itself. The issue which we all want to avoid is prejudice. And prejudice can be solved sometimes by more bias and sometimes by less bias. So the issue, the talk about bias is a bit biased itself. So we should really focus on the prejudice and avoiding prejudice by AI systems. And that is a different discussion than bias or not. which is nothing to do with audit now, but anyway.
Reuben's.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Reuben's.
Oh, okay. What nugget would I finish on? I think that the danger we have with ethics and trying to embed ethics is that there are various forms of low-hanging ethical fruit which are very easy to grab, and there's a danger that low-hanging ethics fruit is a substitute for meaningful legal compliance or other kinds of ethical concerns which are antithetical to the power of those who can make those changes. So don't be misled by low-hanging ethical fruit.
Thank you so much, Reuben. And finally, Luciano.
Right. Well, I'll
can close us off.
I would like to have a word that fills the fourth role in this very elementary equation that we have used for a long time, which is all green policies, all green impact is related to sustainability in the same way as digital technologies, digital environment are related to beep. I like to have the beep. I like to have a word that is as good as sustainable, literally sustainable, for digital technologies. I tried everything. I'm happy to receive emails, socially preferable, but they're all rubbish. So a keyword which says, yes, I like this because it's sustainable, but sustainable has already been used. So something like that, the fourth element in that little equation.
Great points. I want to thank you all for being on this panel. And I know we can't hear the clappings, but there'll be plenty of, so digital claps. And I truly hope that this is the beginning of a long conversation on the topic of AI audit. And we'll be able to engage our groups and our fellow colleagues into the debate and being able to progress. Thank you very much all. And thank you, the audience, for your meaningful question. Jess, over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone. That was absolutely fantastic. And I hope that you join later on. If anything you take away from that, I hope you go and eat an ethical piece of fruit now in the gap between the next session. So thank you so much to everyone and see you on the stage later on.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.